Hello, my name is Alyssa Whetstone. I'm so excited you're here with me today to paint your own masterpiece. You should have this drawing in front of you. It is a drawing of a lighthouse in Duluth, Minnesota. It's on a pier overlooking Lake Superior, which is such a large lake that you cannot see the other side, which kind of reminds me of the ocean. So if you are thinking of another place, of course, this is now your artwork and you can imagine wherever you'd like it to be. What I'm doing here is I'm taping off the edges so that we can really fill our painting with water today. We're going to be doing a pretty epic sky, and so we want to have a lot of water on our paper. When you add a lot of water to watercolor paper, the paper can bend and ripple. So by taping down the edges, we are going to secure our paper and make sure we have nice clean edges when we are finished. One thing you'll want to try to do is make sure your tape is right up against the edge of the drawing. You'll notice that the lines of the drawing do not go all the way to the end of the paper, so that gives you a good spot to stop the tape. Except for in the sky, there are no lines, so what you'll want to do is try to match the width of the tape overlapping the paper to be the same as the other sides, so when we take off the tape at the end, you have a pretty consistent edge around your paper. When you're putting the tape down, give it a good press and rub against the edge. You want it to be sealed against your paper so that no water leaks underneath, leaving that or not leaving the crisp white edge we want. One thing you will want today, in addition to your regular paint, is white paint. That might mean a white paint pen, that's what I'll be using, or acrylic paint or a white gouache. So if you have something like that handy, you can get that ready for later in today's project. If not, you will be just fine and still have a masterpiece. I'm using a very large, wide brush for the beginning of this painting because we are creating the sky and we need a lot of water. If you do not have a large brush like this, that is a-okay. You'll just use the biggest brush you've got. We're going to go ahead and fill the sky, with water. So you might not be able to see exactly what I'm doing. You might be able to see the shininess of the light reflecting, but all I'm doing is I'm getting a lot of water on my brush and I'm spreading it around the sky. I do have to be careful of the lighthouse in the center because I don't want that to get water on it. What we are doing is we are preparing the paper for our paint. Everywhere we add water, our paint will spread and go, and it will mix very nicely together without creating harsh lines. That's what this wash technique does. To really make it successful, you do need to keep your paper fairly wet. So if you notice that areas dry fairly quickly, you'll want to go back and add more water. So even though we are being careful to only put water in the sky, not below the horizon line and not on top of our lighthouse, we do have to move kind of quickly so that that water stays wet while we're working. I've learned the hard way not to paint near a fan or an open window. This would be something hard to do outside where there's a lot of air movement because that will force the paper to dry more quickly than we want. The ink of your drawing on your paper should be waterproof, so it should not be bleeding when you're painting near it. Sometimes if you are really petting your brush on top of the ink for a long time, you might see a small amount of the ink move around. Don't worry, we're going to paint a nice, dark, beautiful sky, so that should just get covered up later. Here I am using the darkest blue I have, and I'm just kind of spreading it around in the water. You should notice that when you add your paint, it likes to move and run around because you've given it a large wet area to play. You probably won't have the same exact colors as me, and I think that's wonderful because we're all different artists and that will make our art different. I'm simply choosing the darkest blue I have, and if your blue is fairly light, you can mix it with a little bit of black or just make it more opaque. To make your paint more opaque, that means you use less water. So you'll want to get a little bit of paint, actually a lot of paint on your brush since there's already a lot of water on your paper. And then if you want it to be lighter, you just have less paint and mix it more with the water. Because I'm going for a dark sky, I'm going to do quite a few layers on this sky because I'm going for a nighttime theme. I'm being very careful along the edges of the horizon line and the lighthouse and spreading that paint out. I don't really want to see the lines of my paintbrush, which hopefully, since I've added lots of water, the paint will kind of spread and move as I'm doing it. But it can help if you really see a line to kind of go over with either more water or more paint and blur those brush strokes away. Now I'm going to be moving to a little bit of a smaller brush that still holds lots of water. So this is a round brush. I'm going to use the same paint, and with lots of it on my brush, I'm going to start adding my second layer. Now, when we're working with watercolor, you have to move from light to dark. So my first layer was fairly light, could even be a daytime sky, and now I really want to get it to be darker. However, I am thinking about kind of some starry galaxy looking things, and so I want to keep some of my sky light. So take a look at how I'm leaving a center part of my sky fairly open and only darkening the outside edges. I'm also kind of jumping my brush around so that I don't see a lot of lines and trying to fill it in by letting it move and spread inside that water wash that should still be wet, since we're also adding more wet paint to it. Once I have really darkened the edges, I can gradually bring that paint towards the center so that it does end up mixing together. If it's getting too dark or I'm seeing too many lines, I can kind of wash my brush off, and I can always dab and pull away some paint. There's always a few methods to kind of lighten up different areas, but I started with the outside edge and then moved to the inside to really keep the outer edges darker than the center of my sky. However, it is still all a night sky, so I do all want it to be fairly dark. This next part, I'm actually going to let it go a little faster than my regular speed because I'm adding little bits of red and purple that are kind of hard to see, and really all I'm doing is playing around. So what I want to see is some other colors in my galaxy sky. So by mixing in a little bit of red, that red is going to mix with the blue and make purple. So I'm dipping my brush into the red paint, making some squiggles, some lines, kind of finding any edges that I need to fill in a little bit more, and using that red to create more variety in the colors of my sky. You could also do this with little bits of green if you want a more teal sort of tone to your sky, but it's not a lot, just a little, and you're just playing, dashing, dabbing, swirling, drawing some lines, kind of blending them around. There's no really perfect way to do this. If you are scared to do this, you can totally skip it and let your sky just be blue. But go ahead and play with some red dashes and dots. Earlier I mentioned there are ways to make things lighter by lifting some of the paint up. Here I'm taking a tissue, and while my sky is still wet, I'm going to ball it up into a small little dot, and I'm going to dash or press kind of against the light post. So where the post of light, lamp post, could be shining, I'm going to lift up a little bit of the blue paint just right around the bottom of it so I can later add the illusion of some glow to it. If your background has dried, you have a few options. You could either leave it, forget about it, the lights could be off, or you could actually add some water back on top of those areas, let the water sit for a few seconds, and then try lifting it off. And it should still work to wake up some of that paint. So I've lifted off kind of right underneath it, and then I've lifted off a little below the lights. And here I'm going back into the center of my sky and trying to make more of that space for the brightness of my sky. So once again, hopefully your paper is still a little bit wet. So I'm kind of dashing and dabbing in bunches and areas. If your paper has started to dry for the sky, you'll want to get the whole sky wet again, just with a thin layer of water. Let it sit for a few seconds to wake up the paint, and then you can press your tissue down into it to lift some color back out. It should again kind of feel random, and then if those edges are too hard, what I'm going back in now is just to again kind of soften and blend those edges to make sure that there is still a transition from light to dark and there's no really harsh lines between where I've painted. Now, while I've got some paint on my brush, the blue, I'm going to go ahead and create some horizontal lines in the water. Look how I'm not filling it all the way in, just using horizontal lines to create the effect of a flat surface of water. I don't want to fill it all the way in or it's going to match the sky, so I'm leaving open bits of white to show the reflection of light, whether that's starlight, moonlight, lamppost light, but those horizontal lines, and I'm leaving little gaps between them. I'm using kind of a flat head brush for this and dragging it side to side. You could also use a thin detail brush to do this, whatever makes the most sense for you. Now that we have painted our sky and water, we actually need to make sure that dries. So grab a cup of tea, some coffee, bottled water, or a hair dryer if you want it to dry faster. And once it is dry, we'll move on to painting the pier and the actual lighthouse. But if they stay wet, they can mix together, and we don't want that. Now that they are dry, it's time to move on to our lighthouse. Now, our lighthouse is going to be mostly white. However, we get to add some shadow and texture to it. So I've got a small detail brush and I'm going into a little bit of black paint, which I want to be gray. To make black paint gray, you just want more water on your brush, less paint. So you'll see how I added it on, and it was fairly dark at first, and then I dried off my brush so that I could smear and blend the edges. Now I'm going across and adding some extra shadows underneath the lines that show each shape of the lighthouse. By following the lines in the edges, making little dashes and dots, we're adding texture and dimension to the lighthouse. Little dashes, lines, these kind of make the lighthouse look more worn or kind of faded, and parts where the water has hit it and maybe created some rust, but we're doing this all in kind of a grayish neutral tone to make our lighthouse look like it is most usually white in the daytime. However, it's nighttime, so it'll look a little more gray. Now we get to work with a pier, and I'm going to mix up a neutral brown tone, but kind of keep it dark again. However, I have to remember that I work from light to dark, so if I make it too dark to begin with, it's hard to go back and add lighter areas. So I'm going to water it down quite a bit so I can spread it around and leave this first layer to be fairly light. I'm making it kind of a yellower brown because this is based on a place that I'm familiar with. But once again, if you are familiar with or you want to imagine it in a different location, you can change that tone or that tint to make it more accurate for what you are imagining. We're going to go ahead and spread this first neutral color all across. If I want it to spread out more without getting darker, I can just add water and use that water to spread and move the color that's already on the paper. If it seems to be fading and I need more color, then of course I grab more color from my paint palette. I'm going to make sure that all the edges that are the same material all have this base color. That's going to make it feel unified, and it's going to create the opportunity to build up from light to dark. So once everything is the same color, then I'll be able to go back and decide, what do I want darker? What side of things have shadows, and what side of things will I leave to be light? So we're creating one layer of all the same value, the same color, and then later we will go and add darkness to it. Whew, that one got really dark. So I went and added more water to my brush, and I'm going to go ahead and spread it around to make sure that it thins out and gets lighter. Once again, while I'm doing this first layer, I want to keep it kind of wet. So this is similar to our sky. We don't need it to be soaking wet, but we do want these next shadows to kind of blend nicely with the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and create a more concentrated type of color, so a little bit more paint, less water. I'm going to go right along the edge of this wall. Now, hopefully, since it's not soaking wet, these lines will not really spread upward onto the wall, but should hopefully spread nicely onto the ground. I'm going to do the same thing kind of on both sides, following the edge of those walls, assuming that there is going to be a shadow along the side where the wall might cast a shadow against the floor. So starting on either side, kind of the same we did with the sky, how we made the edges darker first. Then I washed off my brush, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that paint across from each side towards the center. This should create some more gradual change from light to dark. Look how I'm moving my brush horizontally, not up and down, because the ground is flat. Next, we're going to go ahead and make shadows on one side of each of these pillars. So the side that's facing us is going to be a little bit darker than the other side to make sure that it looks a little bit more 3D. You always want to pick a side to put the shadow on. It can't go on all sides, or that doesn't make any sense, and it just covers up all the light that we did. So I've made all the sides facing me a little bit darker. Now I'm mixing up another shadow for the side walls. This one I tried to make a little bit redder just to make it different from the ground, but you can use the same group of colors or the same mix you've been using for other shadows. I'm going to put this shadow right along the top of the wall, kind of all the way across, and then I'm going to be blending it downward once it's at the top. So since it's nighttime, there really are going to be more shadows than not. So even though we created a light layer at first, most of it will end up getting covered up. So I painted that far away area, painted the bottom edges, and now I'm going to go across and pull down kind of loosely. I've got mostly a dry brush, and pull down that shadow, and it will help also add more texture. You'll see that the drawing has a little bit of texture with some vertical lines, and you are just adding to that texture by pulling that paint down from the top to make it feel darker and also create that worn, washed, water attacked look that this pier has probably gone through a lot of large waves. So pulling down that shadow, but leaving little bits of highlights still, because again, that creates variety. In the back, I'm actually pulling up from the bottom, and then once again, pulling down from the top on the other side. This is creating more texture by not having it filled in as just a flat color. Way in the distance along that kind of crack where the pier changes direction, one's diagonal, one's vertical, you can create those edges on the vertical part. Where the structure is kind of diagonal, that would have more light hitting it since it's almost facing up like the floor is. On the stairs, I'm going to create some horizontal lines. On the walls, I'm going to go ahead and pull down from the top like I did on the side. I'm moving kind of quickly because this is just kind of a loose, scratchy texture attack. And you can kind of do it as you see fit. Just think of vertical lines going up and down, and remember to leave little bits of highlights. Otherwise, go ahead and stretch yourself and see what happens when you add maybe some darker areas, even darker than before. And also take a notice how if your shadows get covered up that we already added, you can always go back on top to make those shadows even more dark. So continually add layers to go from light to dark. So make sure you have a good variety in your values, the lightest lights, and then some places for the darkest darks as well. All right, time to start adding some details. I'm going to go ahead and add some bright yellow into the center of the lighthouse so that it actually has some light in it. So I'm going right into the middle. There's not a lot of open space between the lines, but adding a bit of yellow will help make it look like it is glowing a bit. So I'm going to fill in that center area. Now that I have the yellow, I'm realizing that next to the yellow should actually be the night sky because that is part of the see-through glass where the light would be shining. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up some of that dark blue and fill that in on either side of the yellow. If it ends up too dark, I can go back and kind of try to lift up some of it. Here I'm adding some more of the red just so it matches that kind of purpley red tones I've got going on in my sky. Also, the roof of my lighthouse could be a much darker black since it is really nighttime. So I'm going to go ahead and go right on top of the pen with my black paint to darken that roof line. Same with kind of the base underneath the light. Add some more black for shadows. And then now that my brush is dry, I can kind of lift some of that blue out, add it back, just kind of play to make sure that that kind of matches the sky around it. So you'll see how I'm kind of swirling my brush away from the lighthouse into the sky a tad, just to make sure that blue kind of blends in and fits with everything else. I can't forget to add little bits of yellow to the lampposts as well. And as I'm adding the yellow, I think I'd rather have it be a little bit more orange. Now, I don't actually have an orange in my paint palette. By adding a tiny bit of a red to my paintbrush and putting it kind of on where the yellow is, I'm hoping that will create a little bit more dimension to the yellow, making it a little bit more orange. Now that our most of our details on the pier are done, I've noticed that our water might be a little bit light for a nighttime ocean or lake. So I'm using some more black color. So a little bit of black, maybe a little bit of blue, and I'm again adding those horizontal lines. So I've got a detail brush that I'm using. You might notice that my brush is bent. That is not required by any means. I like it because it helps me kind of get into certain angles when my painting is taped down because I can't turn my painting, so I have to turn my hand instead. So I like the bent brush because I can just rotate the brush to kind of get different angles while I'm painting. But anyways, all I'm doing here is I'm using some darker black paint to make more horizontal lines on the water. You might notice that at nighttime that water really can look black, even more than blue. So I'm trying to use that to my advantage to make the water feel different than the sky above it. So I'm going on top to do more black lines. I want to make sure I do both sides of the lighthouse water. So make sure I've got this water on the left, nice and dark, and then go do all the water on the right as well. One more little detail to go ahead and add here are these red handles on the pier. You could make them any color. I think red is a nice one. That's what they commonly are, so that they can easily be found for people trying to climb out of the water if they happen to fall in. But we'll keep it kind of dark red to make sure they don't really pop too much at nighttime. I'm going to go ahead and fill in those little handles with some red paint on each pier here. If the handle's really far away and you can't see it super well, you can give it a little dash or dab, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. Now, if you're feeling kind of picky, you might have noticed a big blob in my sky that has appeared as it slowly dried. That was somewhere I must have had either too much water, and so as it dried slower than everything else, and it created that kind of funny looking, I don't know, it looks like a scientific-y blob shape, but I want to show you kind of a way to try to get rid of that. I got my brush wet, and I'm kind of trying to wake up the edges of that circle of paint. I have to be careful not to add too much water back to my sky, or I'm going to create more of these silly looking shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and try to wake up just that area, maybe add a little bit of water everywhere across my sky so I don't create any more harsh edges, and hopefully that'll kind of make it start to fade a little bit. When I add a bunch of stars and details, I really shouldn't notice it at the end, but by doing this, it's kind of woken it up. I'm going to go ahead and pull up some paint from the edges of it and hopefully blend it into the background more. So if something like this happens to you, go ahead and add some more water to it and then try to lift up some of the edges and see what you think. So hopefully it makes it a little bit better for you. Now, I am using a white pen to add some details, and if you do not have a white pen like this handy, you've got a few options. You could either skip these sort of details. What I just did was 2 little dots in the light and then in the lighthouse, and now I'm going to be doing a bunch of little stars. If you happen to have acrylic paint on hand, this is another great option as it is opaque and it will cover up bits of your watercolor, so you could go ahead and try some of that. You can either make those dots with a small paintbrush, or actually you can use the end of your paintbrush by dipping the wood part into the paint and then pressing that to make lots of little white dots. You could also use something called white gouache, which might come in your watercolor set. You might have white paint. That is supposed to be more opaque, so hopefully you can use some of that to make some dots and dashes as well. Otherwise, I really recommend having some of these white pens on hand if you are enjoying working with watercolor. They're very easy to use since you can draw with it like a pen or pencil, and they usually work really well to be opaque and cover things up. When I'm doing these stars, I'm making it as random as I can. So some stars are close together, some are far apart, some are bigger, some are smaller. If I accidentally make a dash instead of a dot, maybe it's a shooting star. Now I'm realizing as I tried to make those little dots that my painting was not quite dry, so my gel pen, the white pen, was not working as well as it could have. So that's when I just use a hairdryer, blast it dry a little bit, and then I can continue to try my little dots. Here it seems to be working a little bit better. And these last few stars are bringing us to the end of the masterpiece. I really hope you had fun with this sky. I think that's one of my favorite parts of this one, but also the texture with the pier and the lighthouse. Practicing those layers and using a drier brush or working from light to dark really helps you improve and really enjoy the beauty of a place. So even if you've never seen this pier in real life, I hope you enjoy the beauty that you have created and inspired by all the creation around us. The world is full of so many beautiful places, and you get to enjoy them when you create them. So I hope you had fun in that experience today. When you take off your tape, a few tips. Remember to pull your tape at a 90-degree angle sideways. So I take the end, I keep it close to the table, but I pull away from my artwork. If it starts to tear, you can also heat up the tape a little bit and then start pulling it away. So with a hairdryer, kind of blow it warm and then try pulling away. Once you have taken your tape off, it should have nice clean edges. If not, you can always trim your art too and cut it right against where your paint is. However, the painting is an 8x10, so it's ready for an 8x10 frame now that you've completed it, but you cannot forget to sign your masterpiece. Some people like to use their initials. Some people like to do their full signature. That is totally up to you. And then I hope you frame it and enjoy it at home. If you enjoyed painting today, I hope you go check out what other watercoloring pages I have available at my website, alissawhetstoneart.com. Let me know. I'd love to see a picture of your masterpiece. You can share it on Instagram, tag me, send it to me. I just really hope you had fun creating something beautiful today and getting your hands messy, getting and making something. So I will see you next time. Have a great one.